This is The Inquiry on the BBC World Service with me, Kavita Puri. Each week, one question, 4 expert witnesses, and an answer. In the southern city of Daegu in South Korea, a 61-year-old woman goes to hospital. She has a headache. Over the next week, she meets a friend for lunch, and she attends church twice, along with hundreds of other worshippers of the secretive Shincheonji sect. But her condition worsens, and on February the 17th, 10 days after first feeling ill, she's tested for coronavirus. It's positive. She becomes South Korea's infamous Patient 31. The previous 30 patients had been to China or come into contact with an infected person. Patient 31 had not. It showed the virus was now circulating freely in the country. Soon, thousands of new cases were identified, the vast majority members of the Shincheonji Church. But from a peak of 900 new cases in a day at the end of February, South Koreans have dramatically reduced those numbers. How did they do it? This week, we're asking, what can the world learn from South Korea?
Part 1. Tech and Testing.
Every single day, I've watched the head of the Centre for Disease Control for the last 2 months. Every day, she has briefed the whole country. She has looked more and more tired. Her hair has gone grey.
This is Laura Bicker, the BBC's Seoul correspondent. She's been living in South Korea during the coronavirus crisis.
This feels like the new normal.
When news started coming out of China in early January about an infectious virus, South Korea immediately started preparing.
I will tell you and be very, very honest. I thought, oh my goodness, this is overkill. There are no cases here. What's all the fuss about? This can't be all that bad.
An infrastructure was rapidly put into place, 100 new testing labs to process results, and trained doctors on standby.
And all of that within 17 days from January the 20th, all swung into action.
The 20th of January was when the first coronavirus case was found in South Korea. It was a Chinese national who travelled from Wuhan. By early February, mass testing of the population was already underway. There were twice daily briefings, and Laura Bicker was reporting on it occasionally. But it was on February the 17th.
The day we sat up and took notice was the day that patient number 31, she's become infamous here now in South Korea, was reported.
The authorities tried to track and test the 10,000 church members in the city who were part of patient 31's congregation, whether they were symptomatic or not.
And then they started telling us how many people had symptoms. It was thousands. So that's when we started to take it really seriously. And all of a sudden, everything that I'd thought that perhaps was overkill was far too much. Why are they doing all this? Why have we got 100 labs set up? Why are we getting these daily briefings when there's only 30 patients? All of a sudden it became clear. South Korea knew what was coming.
And they knew what was coming because they'd recently lived through another infectious coronavirus. MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, hit South Korea hard in 2015, killing 38 people. It had alarmed the nation and dented the economy, and protocols were put in place to make sure lessons were learnt. Why did the South Koreans think that testing was so critical?
Well, first of all, their experience from MERS taught them that tracing the infection, tracking the infection, and ensuring that they get patients into quarantine as quickly as possible was crucial, because otherwise it just spreads. They have tested hundreds of thousands of people.
Laura was one of those tested. She'd been reporting in Daegu, a city of 2.5 million people, which had become the epicentre of the country's outbreak, and remember where patient 31 was from. Laura had developed a cough.
So I went to the drive-through centre. Yes, there are drive-through test centres here, 50 of them now set up. It took 5 minutes for the swab. So they rummaged this kind of swab right down the back of your throat, and then they put it up your nose, which is not very pleasant, but hey, that's the way it goes. And then they put it in a test tube. And then I drive off and they tell me that, by the way, you'll get the results in 12 hours in text, which I did.
She was negative, by the way. Across South Korea, mass testing of the population from the beginning of February to date stands at nearly 300,000. It was critical in tracing positive patients, working out who they'd been in contact with and quarantining them. A process helped as
South Korea is known for being one of the most technologically advanced countries in the world. They put that to good use. Now, this is a bit Big Brother-like to others, but what they would do is once they had tracked down an infected patient, they would put their movements on an emergency alert.
legislation enacted since the MERS outbreak 5 years ago gave the government authority to collect mobile phone, credit card and other data from those who test positive. It meant they could reconstruct their recent movements. That information was shared on social media apps, so if South Koreans were in an area where an infected person had been,
you get this screaming message on your phone, which tells you not just where they've been, but what time they were there.
And the app goes into detail of the viral footprint, more than some may want.
He was at the grocery store at 6 p.m. He was in the karaoke bar at 8 p.m. He was there till 1 a.m. and then he was in a love motel until 4 or 5 a.m. That's the kind of detail it goes into. Some people might see it as an invasion of privacy because it does give a lot of information away. In fact, we know that some people have had their affairs outed by these kind of text messages. So they use that technology to allow people to know where the virus was and then kind of check, was I there at the same time? And do I also need to go and get tested?
And once you've been identified as being positive or having been in contact with someone who is, you go into isolation and you'll be made to download the quarantine app. It's GPS mapped, so if you move,
this buzzer will go off, not just on your phone, by the way, on a government officer's phone. So that means that the government know exactly where you are and if you've left your location or if you turn off your phone.
So Laura Bicker says South Korea, given its experience of MERS, was prepared and acted quickly. It was ready to test, trace and quarantine on a large scale, and the government had a critical role to play.
Part 2. Keep it open.
The basic principle is openness, transparency, and fully keeping the public informed. And I think this is paying off.
Our second expert witness is South Korea's Foreign Minister, Kang Kyung-hwa. She highlights her country already had an advantage.
We have a very good healthcare system to begin with.
Indeed, they do. South Koreans have universal healthcare and double the number of hospital beds compared to OECD norms. And they use technology to great effect in helping spread public health messaging.
We have a system that is highly wired, as you can imagine, and fully utilizing that, we have dealt with this outbreak from the very beginning with, just full transparency, and that's the way we've won the public trust and support for this.
Government information was on television, in newspapers and internet adverts, telling people to avoid crowded places and use appropriate preventative hygiene. It was clear, consistent and crucially backed up with mass testing. The Foreign Minister says that as soon as the Chinese made public the genetic sequence of COVID-19, widespread testing became their focus.
because that leads to early detection. It minimizes further spread, and it quickly treats those found with the virus. And I think that's the key behind our very low fatality rate as well.
Local biotech firms crafted their own tests based on that genetic modelling. The first were in place before the surge that came with patient 31. High-volume testing meant authorities could map where the virus was and quickly clamp down when new clusters appeared. And it so far resulted in better outcomes. South Korea has a fatality rate of around 1% of confirmed cases, and they've done this without a lockdown. They've also kept as many international flights going as possible, vetting those who leave and those who arrive.
This is not just about us. We are a country that is highly interdependent with the rest of the world. Our people travel a great deal on businesses, on family visits, on tourism. Our economy depends on this interdependency with the outside world, so we want to keep the doors open with the other countries. And so as this disease spreads to many more countries, we are watching very closely.
So should and could South Korea's approach to widespread testing and use of technology to trace and monitor cases be replicated elsewhere?
It may not be applicable in other countries with, less IT infrastructure and other values, but I think in the end we have to acknowledge that this is not going to be the last time a novel pathogen becomes a global health threat. So we hope that our experience and our approach and model informs other countries dealing with this COVID-19, but also, leading to greater international collaboration for better preparedness when this comes around the next time.
Part 3. Listen to the center.
So I'm the BBC dad guy. Your network made me famous with my kids.
This is Robert Kelly, a political scientist at Busan National University.
Everyone who listens to BBC knows who I am because my kids danced in the back.
You may know him as the man who gave a live television interview from his study when his children barged in. He's seen them a lot while they've been off school these past few weeks.
Well, my kids are outside the door right now, running around screaming. I'm in here talking to you. My wife's keeping them from coming in here and barging in. They're running around and fighting with each other all the time. That's really the challenge. So we're now a month into this.
He too stresses testing widely and tracking those who'd been in contact with infected people was vital. But they were only able to do that because
South Korean state is also sort of large and interventionist, and everybody's got like a national identity number, so it's really easy to track people and stuff like that. And so when you're hunting down all of these people who might have corona, it's really good when you have that kind of tracking and stuff like that already in place.
South Korea, he says, has a very centralized state based around the president in the capital, the merits of which are widely debated in normal times. But in a situation like a pandemic, where decisions need to be taken quickly and rolled out on a national scale.
The sort of extreme centralization, I would argue, of Korean political life on Seoul made it really easy for the country to turn rapidly once the decision had been made in Seoul that this needed to be, grappled with really seriously. Whereas in the United States, you've got just all this overlapping federalism, and that's what you really see in the United States, right? You got Trump and the states and the mayors and stuff like that, and it's just sort of all over the place, right? Now that's by design, that's in the US Constitution.
The Korean state has many tools at hand because, as Robert Kelly puts it, bureaucracy is thick here.
It's very technocratic. The bureaucracy is used to intervening in Korean life a great deal. The Korean government lays out, for example, like what size convenience stores on street corners are allowed to be. And so what that means, though, is that when something like this happens, the Korean state has a lot of tools to move fast. And I think that's been a big boon here.
But also culturally, South Koreans listen to the authorities. So while there was no lockdown, the government urged people to wear masks, wash hands, and socially distance.
People aren't going to schools. They're just not doing stuff. I mean, everything's getting canceled. People don't go to church. Concerts are all over. Nobody's going to the opera or street festival. I mean, all that's gone. I mean, it's all that is just gone.
Were there repercussions if, say, you were out or you did go and try and get a drink? Were the repercussions financial, or were they more social, that people would look at you and think, what are you doing?
My wife and I went to a restaurant once, maybe 6 days ago. Again, there weren't very many people there and everybody was wearing masks and stuff. But, the kids needed to go out because otherwise they're just going crazy. But no, there's no formal sanction. I mean, people stare at you if you're not wearing your mask, that's for sure. In part because I think the uptake on it, the cultural uptake on it, has been really, really good. I'm amazed when I see the stuff on Western Twitter. It's like all those people stuck in American airports. I'm like, oh my God, those people are going to get corona. Nothing like that's happening here.
That's not to say the government didn't make blunders early on. Robert Kelly thinks the decision to delay stopping flights from China at the start could have been politically motivated because the authorities didn't want to jeopardise their relationship with their powerful neighbour. But after that, he says, the government made an important move. They put scientists at the forefront not only of communications, but decision-making too.
I think the Korean government, the politicians more or less got out of the way, and KCDC, the Korean Centers for Disease Control, is more or less pulling all the strings and telling us all what to do. And that's probably the way it should be.
And because it's being led by the scientists and the messaging was unambiguous, he believes people trusted government advice. He thinks there was no room for other theories to fill the vacuum.
You sort of look at the debates you see like in the United States, where you got like 30% of the country who thinks that this is like a North Korean bioweapon or something like that, right? Or it was a hoax and stuff like that, and it was overreaction, all that kind of stuff you hear on like Trumpist media and Fox News, all those conspiracy theories. There's none of that here. There's just none of that.
So a centralised state was critical to making decisions quickly for the entire nation. But how did it work at a local level?
Part 4. Confucius and Swimming Pools.
There was a gentleman I know who runs a cafeteria for taxi drivers. And when the outbreak first started happening, he was quite worried that, there might be a lot of viral transmission there. So he invited me to come in, have a look at the space, and also talk to his workers.
Meet Justin Fendos. He's a cell biology professor at Dongseo University in Busan. At the start of the pandemic, he used his knowledge to speak to those taxi drivers, but was soon inundated by other locals wanting to understand the public health messaging. He was kept busy.
Spending the most time kind of making rounds through the community, visiting churches and senior centers and things like this, helping people better understand what's going on by answering their many science questions.
Far too many for the central government to answer.
For instance, there's one gentleman who was a manager in a hotel, and they have a swimming pool in the hotel. So he was very worried that, is this swimming pool a risk for viral transmission? Other people might ask me things like, well, if I push a button, an elevator button, right after someone else who's sick touches it, what are my chances of getting sick?
I'd love to know what the answer is to that swimming pool question.
The experiment hasn't been done on the current COVID-19 virus as far as I'm aware, but it has been done on other similar coronaviruses. So it turns out that the concentrations of chlorine that you have in your swimming pool will probably inactivate all virus within 1 or 2 minutes.
What about touching the elevator button?
So that one is a pretty complicated equation because it depends on how much virus was actually left on the surface. It's kind of a numbers game where you have to have enough virus come in before the immune system gets rid of all of it.
There was one group in particular that needed a bit more persuasion to follow the government containment rules.
The elderly in Korea, because they tend to be a venerated group because Korea has a very stratified culture and usually you show your elders a lot of respect. They're kind of in a position where they're maybe not so used to being told what to do.
They can be set in their ways, he says, and they may have experienced other calamities in their lives.
Some of them have seen war, the Korean War. Some of them have also experienced economic disasters, like during the 1990s. But this viral outbreak is really something quite different from their, mass accumulation of experience. So in talking with them, it's sometimes difficult to help them use their experiences as a reference point to really understand what's going on now.
And while South Korea has one of the highest scientific literacy rates in the world,
that ability tends not to extend to the elderly because these people went to school before science courses became a core curriculum in elementary, middle, and high school.
So Justin Fentos has tried to involve family members to explain the importance of washing of hands, testing, and social distancing. And he's even had to persuade some elderly people himself. One woman in her 70s had been in contact with an infected person, but was refusing to be tested.
And one of the reasons why she was being difficult is because she kept telling them, I don't understand, why I have to go. I'm not sick. What's the big deal? And so I was asked to come in and try to explain, what was going on. I think just the presence of having someone who was a professor, because Koreans also, they tend to look up to people with high levels of education in general. I think my presence alone eventually did help in letting both of her sons kind of get her on board and say, okay, I'll go get tested.
Once it was explained, she wanted to follow the advice. Justin Fendos says it's important to understand that Korean culture is deeply rooted in Confucian values.
So when the central government puts out an order and says, okay, people, this is what we need to do, Koreans are usually pretty good about following what they're being asked to do. They might complain about it, but they'll usually follow it pretty well. And another aspect that's related to those Confucian values is the desire not to harm other people.
But the point, he says, is that even if the government is quick off the mark, the public health messaging at the community level, even one-to-one, can be critical. So what can we learn from South Korea? With a population of over 50 million, South Korea has managed to greatly slow down the spread of COVID-19 without putting entire cities into lockdown like China. How? It was prepared and had an expansive, well-organised testing programme, quickly isolating people and tracing their contacts. It's been testing over 15,000 people a day, getting results back within 24 hours. It's had clear public messaging with no room for conspiracy theories, and people have listened. New clusters of infection are still appearing, but the health system hasn't been overwhelmed. Their message to the world is prepare, test, trace, and isolate.
This edition of The Inquiry was presented by Kavita Puri. It was produced in London by John Murphy. The editor is Richard Varden. The program was mixed by Neil Churchill, and if you would like to get in touch with any of the team, you can email The Inquiry, that's one word, The Inquiry, at bbc.com, or tweet at BBC The Inquiry.
Coronavirus.
Self-isolation.
Extreme measures.
Still, the disease spreads.
As the coronavirus story develops, we're bringing you the very latest.
Many governments have announced new measures to try to contain the virus.
A daily roundup of news, information and health advice.
We are in new territory.
And reports from affected areas.
There's been confusion all day here.
The Coronavirus Global Update from the BBC World Service. Find it wherever you get your podcasts.